So politicians were talking about discrimination toward white people. I mean, and they still are, right? But there's something that feels innocuous about this. I say it's not. I explain why it's not. And some people were complaining that there was no White History Month. That feels qualitatively different than the more explicit and overt discussions we've been having in recent years over, say, the Great Replacement Theory, where we are just openly discussing the conspiratorial claim that the Democratic Party wants to increase immigration to change the racial and ethnic composition of the US and wipe out white people and to benefit the Democratic Party's electoral fortunes.
Hello, thank you for joining us and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics today, and we also care deeply about pastries. A few items of note from the past few weeks in American politics. So President Trump fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, really for no other reason than that C.Q. Brown recorded a video following the George Floyd killing in 2020 about what it was like to be Black in the armed forces. Another item, many areas of the federal government are being scoured and defunded because they include DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusiveness initiatives. Donald Trump also recently suggested giving all schools an ultimatum to remove DEI initiatives or lose all federal funding, although he later walked that back. The through line of these and many other recent stories from this administration is race. Race is obviously deeply tied to this administration's agenda. It's also clearly central to how both parties operate today and historically. So today we're going to talk about the intersection between race and the political parties. To discuss that, we are fortunate enough to be joined by political scientist Ashley Jardina. Ashley Jardina is an associate professor of public policy at the University of Virginia and a graduate of the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on racial attitudes, racial conflict, and the way in which group identities influence political preferences in the United States. She is also the author of the 2019 award-winning book, White Identity Politics, published by Cambridge University Press. It is a book that I'm a big fan of, and I'm not alone on that. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. Thank you. So, Ashley, your book, White Identity Politics, examined the growth of a sense of group identity among white Americans, really in the 21st century. As you described it in this book, white identity was distinct from animus toward other races, although one could lead to the other. So, first of all, am I describing that correctly? And do you see any changes in U.S. politics that that would make you update things since the book came out?
Yeah, this is a really great question that gets at a very important distinction. So let me get a little bit in the weeds here for a
Okay.
minute. Okay, so for people who aren't super familiar with research on white identity politics, let me first explain that what we're talking about are white people who have a psychological attachment to their racial identity. These are people who believe that being white is important to them, it's central to their sense of self. I'm also perhaps even more interested in this related concept that I kind of just put under the umbrella of quote unquote white identity politics that we call racial consciousness. People talk about consciousness as a politicized form of identity. And so the difference is that consciousness captures not only this attachment to being white, but also this sense of grievance, this feeling that one's racial group is somehow threatened, that it's challenged within a racial hierarchy, and then also this desire to work politically to protect the group. So you may have heard academics throw around this term status threat, and that's in part exactly what my work on white identity politics captures. This belief that white people's dominant and privileged status in the US is threatened by things like immigration, changing demographics, and the political and economic success of people of color. So it's not so much that white identity is devoid of any negative attitudes or even hostility toward people of color, although for some people there's some of that. So, one way to think about it is you don't have to dislike a group of people in order to potentially feel threatened by them. But I think what's really helpful to explain is that white identity politics and white consciousness is distinct from how social scientists and academics usually think of racial prejudice. So we almost always define prejudice as either this irrational hostility toward members of a group or this kind of socialized set of stereotypes or socialized animus that we learn from our friends, we learn from our family, we get from the media. And then these things either consciously or unconsciously influence our behavior. But I think, kind of ironically, actually, for political scientists who have long been interested in the political consequences of prejudice, the thing I always say is the prejudice paradigm has nothing to say actually about power. And what white consciousness is about the feelings of threat and grievance that white people have, sometimes toward racial outgroups as a result of threats to their group status and power. So I've argued in my work, these attitudes have been central to the MAGA movement, and that's absolutely persisted over the course of the past 8 years. And really, if anything's changed since my book came out, it's that these feelings have become even more entrenched in the public mind, and they've become central to Republican Party politics. And so, one very clear signal that this is true is the public reaction to critical race theory and now DEI, because at the core of these debates is this idea that's not, I think, erroneous idea that white people are somehow being victimized and are experiencing discrimination.
Wow, thanks for that. John?
Yeah, so Ashley, thanks so much for being here. Like one of the things that I've wrestled with a little bit when thinking about whiteness and how it intersects with politics is that the category of white isn't really fixed. And I think, if 100 years ago you had said that Catholics and Jews and Anglo-Saxon Protestants would be considered the same politically, people would have looked at you like you had two heads, right? The idea that someone whose last name is Jardina and someone whose last name is Hagner and someone whose last name is Maskett are all basically in the same category wouldn't have made sense. And I think as you look in the very contemporary MAGA movement, you've got people like Enrique Tarrio, who's the leader of the Proud Boys, who I would define as core to MAGA, but his heritage is Latino. You've got people like Usha Vance, JD Vance's wife, who is Indian American. Now, one of the things I'm curious about is, do you think that the category of how we define white is going to change and expand in the years to come, and more people are going to be brought into it, or do you think it's a category that's going to get smaller and more precisely defined?
Yeah, so to exactly your point, right? One way that the in prior eras threats to white identity or whiteness have been resolved is we've expanded the category of whiteness, right? So it's why, like, just as you were saying, Irish, Italians, Jewish people, Hungarian people, we're all now considered white. And the exact debates that we're having today, we were having in the 1920s when we had a huge percentage of the United States was foreign born. We were talking about sort of preserving the United States as a white country, and that's how we sort of got out of it. I mean, it was a long process. So I can't say for sure that that's what's going to happen, but there's a lot of evidence that we're moving in this a similar historical trajectory, particularly with Hispanic Americans. And I mean, there's something like alluring about whiteness, right? Sort of both within the United States and globally. Like people want to be proximate to it because it does, in many ways, represent power and belonging in the U.S.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've seen in polling, it's a slow trend, but a lot of Hispanic voters who 20 years ago, Hispanic Republicans would have identified themselves as Hispanic and Republican, but more politically conservative Hispanics are now less likely to identify themselves as such. And, race and ethnicity are obviously not exactly the same, but we have seen, you can see it in census data, you can see it in polling data, a trend away from Hispanic identification among more politically conservative folks. And I wonder if, just like voting by mail has become, and being going to college, these have become partisan signifiers, if how you choose to identify is going to have more to do with your politics than your identity in the next couple decades.
I think that's spot on, and there's a lot of evidence that that's true. There's even evidence that I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, but the American National Election Study asks Hispanic Americans how important being white is to their identity, and like some sizable percentage of people who check the Hispanic box also answer that it's like
Hmm.
somewhat, if not very, important to them. And I think it says a lot about the kind of democratic strategy over the past couple decades, which was to try to cultivate this ethnic identity because the sort of idea was like that would be politically expedient, right? And it's true in the sense that Hispanic Americans who have a stronger ethnic identity are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. But it's not the case that that effectively captured the entire group, right? And so you have a lot of people who are distancing themselves from that and are aligning with the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think of 20 years ago, Democrats looked at Texas and said, these trends are going to continue and Texas will be a blue state, not understanding that, first of all, Hispanics could become more Republican and that Hispanics could become less Hispanic, right? And these trends happen in the same way.
Yep.
Um, so I was really drawn to and intrigued by this book when it came out because I was working on another book at the time. It was my 2020 book, Learning from Loss, also with Cambridge Press, put in a little plug for it here. That was about fights within the Democratic Party. And there were terms that Democrats threw around at the time and still throw around, like identity politics and electability, that had racial connotations to them, but weren't necessarily discussed that way on the surface. I'm curious if you think this is still accurate in 2024. Like, how do you see racial politics and white identity playing out on the Democratic side as the party sort of reckons with how Kamala Harris got nominated last year, her election loss, and what the party's thinking about going forward?
I mean, it feels so clear that there's just no consensus within the Democratic Party about how to talk about race, right? I think
Hmm.
there's this anxiety that talking too much about race is going to drive many of the like remaining white working class Americans, they're part of the Democratic Party, in a different direction. And there might be some truth to that. I think it's also really interesting to think about how much has happened over the past 8 years and where we are now. So it's wild to think that in the summer of 2020, we were watching some of the largest racial justice protests in the history of our country. We were tearing down Confederate monuments, we were renaming streets and buildings, and now today we are unraveling decades of racial progress by eliminating affirmative action in higher ed and doing away with policies and programs that were meant to foster equality and prevent discrimination.
Yeah, 2020 was a hell of a moment and a
Mhm.
very brief moment. But
Yeah,
yeah, please,
exactly.
please go
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
I live about 15 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered, and so we feel that very deeply here in Minneapolis.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just like we just bouncing around to extremes here in ways that we really hadn't for the latter part of the 20th and into the early part of the 20th century. I think there's not a lot of evidence that most Americans want to take things as far as the Trump administration is taking them, but it does feel like there's this belief that, particularly among members of the Democratic Party, that many Americans are somewhere between wary of and then outright hostile toward the party's attention to racially progressive policies. And I think this is a tricky perspective because some of my work with Trent Olorenshaw, we find that white Democrats are more racially progressive than they have ever been. And so some of those effects started emerging, like I would say they were accelerating after 2020, but you started seeing this shift before then, really at the end of the Obama years, moving into the Trump years. And those trends have actually endured. I mean, some of that is the shifting composition of the party over the past 8 years, and the party is still trying to win back the white working class, many of whom are not as liberal on their views of race. But I think they're stuck really in this difficult position. How do you cater to both the core constituents of color, and then how do you try not to alienate the white working class? And I don't know that talking about race is actually alienating them, but there's this at least belief that it is.
Right. And I think that's all really confounded by the fact that if you believe exit polls, which obviously there's grains of salt there, Harris did better with white people than Biden did.
Yep.
The reason that the Democrats lost, and as the one person who gets to wear a partisan hat 100% of the time, and I can say we, right? Like the reason we lost is not because white people moved away from us. It's because voters of color who still mostly supported Democrats less than they had before. And a lot of those voters also don't like that the emphasis on race that they see, right? That there's often feelings of, you're trying to say that I didn't deserve all the hard work that I've done, you didn't deserve to be where I am. And I think, as it's a really huge problem for Democrats to grapple with, because the white people, or the people of color who remain in the Democratic Party by definition don't agree with the ones who are leaving, and it becomes this very difficult thing to kind of get your brain around.
Yeah, that's right. And there's just there's a couple stories to tell here too. Like one is about are people changing their minds and switching parties and voting for different candidates, Republicans in some elections and Democrats in others. But mostly this is worse a story about turnout and enthusiasm. So I think that that has to be part of the conversation. And I also think that we need a couple more election cycles before we really understand what's happening with voting behavior among people of color. Because another way of telling the story is that the Republican vote among Black Americans, the Black men in particular, and Hispanic Americans looked like it did pre Obama, right? So Obama is this extraordinary exception to voting and turnout. And it looks like we've mostly reverted to where we were before. No, that's still an interesting question, right? Like we have, by way of her identity, Harris, you would have hoped would have generated more enthusiasm. But I think that a lot of the conversation is just people aren't as enthusiastic about voting for the first woman of color, first woman, as they might have been a couple, election cycles ago.
Mm. Um, we've talked a little bit about this, but let's pivot to the Republicans for a second. So, like, if Democrats use a scalpel when talking about race, Republicans use a sledgehammer. At least Donald Trump seems to feel a lot more comfortable talking about race than Democrats do. Um, I'm curious what you think. Like, have his appeals and Republican appeals to white identity, how have they ramped up in recent years? Is there a downside to this? Is there a backlash that this generates? What are we seeing so far?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was first writing about white identity politics, part of my argument about the danger of the discourse around it was how subversive and it sometimes subtle it was. So politicians were talking about discrimination toward white people. I mean, and they still are, right? But there's something that feels innocuous about this. I say it's not. I explain why it's not. And some people were complaining that there was no White History Month. That feels qualitatively different than the more explicit and overt discussions we've been having in recent years over, say, the Great Replacement theory, where we are just openly discussing the conspiratorial claim that the Democratic Party wants to increase immigration to change the racial and ethnic composition of the US and wipe out white people and to benefit the Democratic Party's electoral fortunes. The downside to this is that it feels like whatever breaks we felt were baked into our norms of racial equality, that they're largely shot. There's little about white grievance politics today that feels covert or uncertain, and the current presidential administration has exploited these beliefs to bulldoze the federal government and to tear down so many federal programs and policies that moved us closer to racial equality. I mean, I think there has been a backlash among Democrats in the US. Part of that backlash is what I mentioned before, just this massive shift in racial attitudes over time where white Democrats have become incredibly racially progressive. But it's clear that that's not enough, right? That's not a strong enough force in electoral politics to change the tide.
Yeah. I've wanted to go back actually to the Obama. We talked about Obama a couple times, and I think he's such an interesting figure in this discussion because obviously the trends that we're talking about predate him, but in some ways, a lot of my work was in Ohio, and I worked for the Obama campaign in Ohio in 2008 or in 2012, and the Obama numbers, particularly in 2008, in a lot of the places we would think of as epicenters of white resentment, are the high watermark for Democrats, right? Obama got 40% in some of these rural farm counties in Ohio, where Sherrod Brown, who, is a working class white Democrat, got 15 in his most recent election. And I think one of the things I think that confuses and confounds a lot of people on this topic is if white identity is what's driving some of this, why did the first black president do better than subsequent white Democratic nominees? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, one reason is because of turnout among people of color, right? So he mobilized a huge subset of the electorate that doesn't always vote, also young people, white people. The flip side to this point, right, is that we get to 2012 and Obama wins with the lowest share of the white electorate of any victorious presidential candidate ever, right? So, between 2008 and 2012, there's a decline. Now, let me throw out a little fun fact that I think I'm going to say this is not definitive, but it's intriguing. If you look at the 2012 American National Election Study and you build a model predicting vote choice with kind of the standard ingredients we think go into who you're going to vote for, including racial attitudes. White identity is doing a little bit of work there, and racial prejudice is basically doing no work. And the strongest predictor are attitudes about the national economy. This is interesting to me as somebody who studies racial attitudes because you thought that the whole story for over the entire Obama era is that like Obama's getting punished because of his race. And the turnout among whites suggests that that's true. But, at least American National Election Studies suggest that it's perhaps was more a story about the national economy and less a story about people bringing to bear their racial attitudes on their vote choice.
Unless their positions on the economy are driven by their politics and their
Yeah,
racial identity.
that's an
Yeah.
excellent point, and there's certainly some evidence that that has been happening over time. Yeah.
I mean, I sort of wonder how much it's relevant that, both of Obama's Republican opponents, John McCain and Mitt Romney, basically didn't want to go there on race. They did not overtly discuss it. Whereas in 2016, Donald Trump obviously did. And it's just sort of like, you had sort of both candidates going out of their way to not make race central to the campaign. And I think 2016, that effort was obviously off the table.
Yeah, it's straight. And
Yeah.
I always point to this as there was a different path, right? Like we didn't have to go. This was the Trump and the race politics of the contemporary United States was not, I don't think it was inevitable. Like the Republican Party and Republican leadership could have made different choices.
Um, you've written, I think, more recently about the relationship between racial animus and racism and democratic erosion. And I was hoping you could sort of, describe your work on this, whether the events of the past year have reinforced that or compelled you to change your mind or update things.
Yeah, so Rob, Mickey, Vincent Hutchings, and I are working on a project that's specifically about this relationship between white grievance politics, democratic erosion, and support for autocracy under Trump. And our main argument is actually really in keeping with your latest Substack post. So
Oh, thank you.
yeah, so we argue that most eras of democratic decline in the US have been centered around a resistance to multiracial democracy. So, this resistance to extending the rights and privileges of democracy to groups that aren't considered white by the standards of the time. And that's just as true today. So, we argue that you can't understand what's happening in the US now without paying attention to race. And it's not a story wholly just about racial animus. It's tied up in whites' concerns about status threat and their worry about their loss of power. So, the way I like to put it is that many white Americans are not committed to democracy in principle. Instead, they support whatever form of government they believe benefits their racial group. And what Trump has done so well is he's clearly connected protecting the interests of whites to his push toward autocracy.
Wow. It's a weird moment to pivot, but you want to talk about baking?
Absolutely. I mean, we all need
Yeah.
a little
That's
levity
what
in this, right?
I
Like,
know.
yeah.
Yeah.
This is literally what every conversation I've had this year feels like. It's like smart, smart, interesting, interesting. Oh, yeah. The last one that I had, we were discussing, we're pretty sure that there's more than a 50% chance that we still have free elections, but it's less than 100. And it's a weird place to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we got to prepare. But yeah, as you know, Ashley, we always end this with a little bit of talk about baking. Seth, what's the aftermath of your ammonia cookies?
Oh, so yeah, on last week's show, I talked about using ammonia bicarbonate to bake cookies, and it produced these wonderful cookies, but a horrible smell. And I did not end up using my oven a lot over the last week, but then I baked some bread over the weekend and was shocked to find that the oven still smelled like ammonia and made my apartment smell like ammonia. So I'm rethinking the use of ammonia, I have to say, unless you have a really well ventilated house. I'm paraphrasing Kenny Rogers. Promise me, son, not to do the things I've done. Use baking soda if you can. Anyway, that's my update. I still have a fair amount of the ammonium bicarbonate if anyone wants to borrow it.
No, you don't. You don't make it sound that compelling.
But Ashley, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about. We understand you participated in a political baking contest back in 2008. Is that correct? When you were a graduate student?
Yeah, so when we were talking about the theme of the podcast, my mind immediately went to this just by way of politics and baking. And so in 2008, there was it felt like a kind of popular blog that some person was running called Yes We Cake. And people were sending in their Obama themed baked goods. And a bunch of my friends and I in graduate school liked to engage in what we called procrastinating, where, right, we would just bake all the time instead of reading whatever journal articles we were assigned to read for class. And so we took our ever improving baking skills to our election enthusiasm, and we made an Obama cake and we sent it in, and we were so thrilled that it appeared on yescake.com.
So it got highlighted on the blog. Did it win any sort of award? Were they doing anything like that?
No,
Or
I mean, it
okay,
mostly just got highlighted on the blog, but I told you I was clearly so proud of it that I took a screenshot
yeah,
and I sent it to you, right? So I needed to commemorate this because it felt like such a big deal to
oh
actually
well,
And
get a claim to
it is
fame.
beautiful.
I'll definitely post that on our blog, on our website. Yeah,
Yeah, you can see. I told you it's an incredible blast from the past because I've got like Instant Messenger, AOL Instant Messenger open on the bottom, and shout out to Christina Wolbrecht, who I was Googling. You can like see her name at the top in the Google search bar because we were reading her amazing work in one of my grad classes.
fantastic.
Were we ever so young?
I
And
know,
then
I know, but it was such a different time, right? It was so full of hope and possibility, so innocent.
and as you say, when a different path was there for us
Yeah,
that we did not walk down.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has really been fascinating. Obviously, your work is both important and growing increasingly relevant with each passing hour. So we really appreciate you sharing this, and we wish you luck with everything you're working on right now.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
All right, good talking to you,
Thanks.
and thanks everyone for tuning in, and stay safe. Thank you for listening to this episode of Power and Flower. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We encourage you to follow and rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. Watch for new episodes at the end of each week.